So what do you say we spend a little time in the garden today? All right. So on our last video, we finished up planting this plot right here, which has a lot of cool season or all cool season vegetables in it. And I promised you that on the next video or two, we were going to talk more about comparing this plot, what we did here, kind of our techniques and strategies here versus that plot back over there where we're doing some no-till gardening. And so today that's what I want to do. We want to talk about what's going on here, what we did here, what we did in the other plot, and kind of see if there are any discernible differences and talk about a lot of the comments and questions we had when we first explained this experiment we're doing. So let's start off with this plot right here where we've got carrots planted, kale, collards, Brussels sprouts. We just planted some all-top turnips, and we got a row of herbs, and we just direct seeded a row of rutabagas in there. And in this plot, we're doing things kind of the way we've always done them around here, or at least, you know, for the last 5 or 6 years or so. So in late summer, we had a cover crop of sunflowers planted in this plot. All these plots are 30 by 35. And after those sunflowers kind of bloomed and did their thing, we came in and mowed the sunflowers down, you know, just scalped them with the soil, kind of chopped up all them sunflower stalks, left them on the plot there to add a little organic matter. And then when we got ready to plant some fall stuff here, or when we were getting this plot ready, we came in here and dumped about 1 to 2 tons of good gin trash compost. We use that on pretty much all of our plots around here. Dumped about 1 to 2 tons of that compost per this 1,000 square foot plot, and we came in here with a tiller and incorporated it into the soil. And then when we planted this stuff, we planted everything on subsurface drips. You can see my drip main line running right there, and we have the drip tape buried along the row, and we have things planted on top or right to the side of the drip tape. In the case of the carrots and the rutabagas, we direct seeded those. Everything else in here was transplanted. So we have the drip tape buried. We're watering our plants that way. We tilled in the compost, and as far as fertilization or feeding our plants go, we've been feeding these with our 20-20-20 and our micro boost every couple weeks, injecting that through the drip system here. And in this plot here, we did things a lot different, a good bit different. So in the summer, as opposed to the cover crop of sunflowers we had over there, we had a cover crop of iron clay peas here, which is a nitrogen fixer. Once those peas were almost about to bloom, we came in, we mowed them down, we just kind of chopped and dropped all that debris right onto the soil in this plot. We then put one of our black silage tarps over that plant debris and left it here probably 5 or 6 weeks or so. Everything could kind of break down and prevent us from having any new weed pressure there. We pulled that tarp off of here, and we still had a good bit of that pea debris there that hadn't broken down completely. So we came in here and put 3 tons of that good gin trash compost on this plot. The goal was to cover up all that pea debris. So we put compost in there thick, about that thick right there. Nice thick layer of compost. We're not using any drip irrigation in here. We did do a video where we showed you using our dibble wheel attachment for the wheel hoe. We used that to mark kind of where our plants were going to go along the row. And we transplanted everything in this plot. We haven't direct seeded anything in here. So we went in where those little holes were marked with our dibble wheel attachment, stuck those little transplants in the ground. We've got lettuce, we've got cabbage, we've got broccoli, cauliflower, and then some more lettuce on that far side of the plot here. So we've just been using my tripod sprinkler back there to overhead water this plot. No drip tape, no cultivation whatsoever. This hasn't been tilled since right before we planted that iron clay pea cover crop back in the summer. As far as fertilization goes, we haven't been using any synthetic fertilizers here, just been using some organic stuff. This fish and guano here, I've been injecting that through my overhead sprinkler to kind of feed this plot all at one time, feed the soil, feed the plants, all that good stuff. Now this little comparison here is not completely scientific at all. We'll talk about that more in just a minute. One reason is we have different stuff planted in each plot, but we can at least compare stuff from the same crop family. So let's just look at our brassicas here. Look at our collards, our kale, and our Brussels sprouts in this traditional plot, and then take a look at our brassicas over here in the no-till plot. Now, because we're comparing apples and oranges, we can't really measure the plants and compare them, but if I had to make a judgment right now, I'd give a slight edge to this no-till plot here. So I showed you both of those plots, kind of gave you a little background on what we did in each plot up to this point. As I said, we can't really compare anything scientifically. Everything's pretty subjective at this point. We can just kind of look at the plants and kind of just give a rough idea of these look like they're doing better than these are. And I'll explain in a minute why it's not perfectly scientific. Before I get there, I do want to explain something about tilling. I'm not a huge proponent of tilling all the time. We probably only till these plots 2, 3, maybe 4 times a year. We're usually only tilling when we're turning over an old crop into a new crop. So in the situations of crop turnover, or when we're adding amendments like compost or chicken manure or whatever. So we're not doing a lot of frequent tilling. We're not tilling on a weekly or bi-weekly or even monthly basis in here to manage or keep our garden cultivated. We're just tilling when we need to. And I believe that repeated tilling will eventually damage your soil structure. I've seen it done where people till between their garden rows every week or so, and they ended up with just this powder that doesn't hold any nutrients, and it's just like sand almost. So we don't really believe in tilling a lot. We just till when we feel like it's necessary. And so with this experiment, I just wanted to see, well, not tilling at all, what's the differences between just not doing it all versus doing it a little bit like we normally do. Now, as we stated, and as lots of people in the comments stated on that previous video, this is not very scientific at all. We've got a lot of what we call confounding variables here. So if we were being super scientific with this, what we would have done is taken 2 of these plots. We would have added the same amount of compost to both plots. We would either put drip irrigation in both plots or put no drip irrigation in either plot. We would have planted the same crops, the same varieties in each plot, the same amounts of each variety in each plot. And the only thing we would have varied is the fact that we tilled the compost in versus just putting it on top of the soil like we did here. But that really isn't feasible. I mean, if we were going to test all of them factors, it would take way more plots than I have here. And I didn't want to grow the same thing in each plot because I want a variety to eat through the fall and winter. So it wasn't really feasible for me to be super scientific about it. So what we're actually doing here is just kind of comparing 2 systems or 2 methods, 2 ways of doing things. We've got the traditional way we always do it, and then this way here that we're trying out to see if there's a big discernible difference in doing it this way. And with this whole comparison, we're not trying to be divisive here, and really don't encourage any divisive comments on any of the videos. Everybody's got their own way of doing things. Everybody's got ways that work for them. This system right here of just adding compost on top and not tilling probably isn't going to work for everybody. And on the other hand, my traditional system of burying the drip tape and doing things that way, tilling the compost in the soil, may not work for everybody as well. So there's not a one size fits all solution to gardening, and it's good that we have different techniques we can share, and we're just going to compare these 2 as we go along and look at the disadvantages and the advantages of each. Now, a lot of people were asking, why didn't I use drip tape in this no-till plot? And here's the thing with drip tape with me. If I can't bury the drip tape, I just as soon not use it. I've put it on top of the soil before, and I don't care for it that way. It gets in the way, the wind blows it around. It's just a mess in my opinion. So either I'm going to bury drip tape and plan on it buried, or I'm not going to use it at all. And we still had a lot of that pea debris in here, so we couldn't really run our plow through there and make a furrow to bury the drip tape. I didn't want to disturb the soil because I thought that might skew our results here. So since I couldn't bury the tape, I'm just not going to use the tape at all, and that's why we've been using the tripod sprinkler here. Another common comment or question we had had to do with weed pressure, and people assumed that we were doing this no-till situation as a result of weed pressure. And just to be clear, I'm not trying this in an attempt to reduce weed pressure. I understand that a lot of people do the back to Eden or no-till gardens as a way to try to reduce their weed pressure, but that's not why we're doing it here. To be honest, weed pressure is not a huge thing for me, and that's not, you know, being boastful about it. It's just we have our weeds pretty well under control. There are certain things we do so that weed pressure is not a big bugaboo for us. It's not something we just battle all the time. We plant a lot of cover crops here, which breaks those weed growth cycles, helps out a lot with that. We do a lot of tarping, which we did in this plot here. That helps out with our weed pressure. We also believe in frequent shallow cultivation, even if that cultivation is just, you know, a ½ inch or ¼ inch below the soil surface there. Just minor disturbance there is going to eliminate any thread-like weeds and remove any existing weeds that are there. And to me, weeding is just an effort thing. You know, you just got to be diligent about it. Come out to your garden once or twice a week, walk around. Doesn't take long. It only takes me about 10 minutes for one of these 1,000 square foot plots, just to kind of keep everything, you know, managed. Make sure no big weeds are there. We definitely don't want weeds to go to seed. And all these things we do have to do with our weed seed bank. So the weed seed bank is the amount of weed seeds that are in your soil already. And we want to keep that bank low. And if we can keep that bank low, we're not going to have a lot of weed pressure. That means we can overhead water this plot 2 or 3 times a week. And even if we don't weed it that week, it's not like we're going to have a huge explosion of weeds in there because our weed seed bank is low. Now, we can't control weeds from outside sources like the wind blowing weed seeds in, or, you know, birds pooping weed seeds out in our garden plot. We can't, you know, we can't control those external sources of weed seeds. We can control our weed seed bank within these plots here by not letting the weeds that are there go to seed. And that tarping process, you know, allows the weed seeds that are there to germinate, and then they die because that tarp is there. So weeds are not a huge problem for us. Weeds are not the reason we did this experiment. I understand that's why a lot of people go to no-till, but that's not why we did it. And if we were to compare the weed pressure between the 2 plots where we're using buried drip tape versus the overhead sprinkler, I would say there has been a little more weed pressure right here where we're using the overhead watering system. And that makes perfect sense. We're watering everything here, watering between the rows, whereas over there we're just watering right below the plant. So weed pressure hasn't been overwhelming at all. I've just been walking through there about twice a week with this little guy right here, this little bat wing hoe, and kind of just barely scuffing the soil, removing any of those small weeds. We keep it pretty clean that way. So neither one has a substantial amount of weed pressure. Of course, the overhead's going to give you a few more weeds than the buried drip is. Now let's talk about mulch. So of all the comments, probably the most talked about thing in that video discussion thread there was mulch. A lot of people said this isn't going to work unless you put some mulch on top of that compost, or it's not real no-till unless you put mulch on it. Mulch, 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 mulch. Now, I'm not going to say I'll never mulch my vegetable gardens, but I have no plan to do so anytime in the future. I have tried mulching around certain rows of plants before and just wasn't a huge fan of it. Certainly not planning on mulching an entire plot anytime soon, and I'll tell you why. So down here in South Georgia, we're growing food year round. With the exception of a little bit of a slow time in August and September, we're growing food year round. Most of the crops we grow in the vegetable garden, a lot of them have anywhere from a 60 to 90 day maturity date. So the turnover is pretty quick. So we're always harvesting crops, pulling up old ones, planting new ones. It's just a constant crop turnover here with some cover cropping in the mix there. And because we're having constant crop turnover, that means our row spacing is constantly changing. Here with these fall crops, I use a standard 3-foot row spacing on most of that stuff. But if I come in here this spring, or this upcoming spring, and plant squash in here, I'm certainly not going to plant that on a 3-foot row spacing. If I plant pumpkins or winter squash in here, I might put those on a 10-foot row spacing. And so if I had mulch down here, I would be constantly moving mulch out of the way to account for my changing row spacing that happens as a result of my crop rotation. And that's just something I don't really feel like doing. So that's one reason why we don't mulch. Another reason we don't mulch is because of cover crops, and I mentioned that. We use cover crops to feed our soils, to break pest cycles, to break weed cycles, and I just think it would be tough to seed a cover crop into a thick layer of mulch and expect to get really good germination. I like to plant my cover crop seed in soil, not wood chips or straw or some kind of mulch. And the cover crops, like I said, they're an essential part of what we do around here, of keeping our soil healthy, managing pests and diseases and weeds. So I don't really see how cover crops would fit into that mulching system really well. Third reason we don't mulch is because we have these little boogers around here called fire ants, and they love undisturbed areas. And so if you put mulch on a garden and don't walk out there in it, you're not walking around with a hoe, you know, taking out some of those little thread-like weeds every now and then, and it's just, you know, virtually undisturbed, you're going to get a lot of fire ant problems around here, and that's no fun. So we have fire ants, we have termites. They like undisturbed areas. That's why we don't ever see them in our garden here, because we're always walking in them and everything. With mulch, they would just love that, and we'd see fire ant beds everywhere. So that's another reason why I'm not mulching. And the last one is, even if I wanted to, I don't really have good access to any wood chips or anything like that. We can get wheat straw, but it's pretty expensive. It's about $6, $7 a bale depending on where you get it. So I don't have any good access to mulch if I wanted to. I have really good access to some good compost I can get pretty affordably, but I don't have a good access to any mulch. So lots of reasons there why we don't mulch. And so this here is pretty much as no-till as I'm going to get, folks. Basically, whether it's a cover crop or vegetable crop, pulling it out, mowing it down, tarping it, coming in with a heavy layer of compost and planting into that. No plans of ever adding mulch. Now the other thing a few people talked about, and this kind of goes back and ties in with the mulching theme, is interceding cover crops between these rows back here. And all of this goes back to the idea of weed suppression. And if I had really bad weed problems, all of these, you know, are valid ideas. But I don't have bad weed problems because we kind of stay on top of things, as I mentioned. So some of these are hard to wrap my head around and hard for me to justify doing, because weeds are not really that big of an issue at this point. But back to the cover crop interceding thing, and I've seen this done, seen pictures of it. It looks beautiful when it's done. It makes sense. And so basically what you would do is you would either plant a cover crop on this entire plot and then cultivate just a little narrow path there where you're going to plant your vegetables, or you would have your vegetables planted and you would come behind and seed cover crops in the pathways there. And similar to the mulch idea, this would work great if you had a fixed row spacing. I don't have a fixed row spacing. I'm not planning on permanent beds where everything is 3 feet apart or 4 feet apart. I change my row spacing all the time depending on what's planted here. In my opinion, almost every crop has a row spacing that works well with it. We're not going to plant squash on a 3-foot row spacing. We're not going to plant lettuce on a 5-foot row spacing. So that row spacing is always changing. That would make the interceding of cover crops tricky. The timing of it also would be a little bit tricky in my opinion. So let's just say, for instance, we're talking about our spring and summer garden. So I come in here and I plant a warm season cover crop in between these rows here. Say sorghum, sudan grass, millet, whatever. I'm still going to have some level of maintenance there, because I'm going to have to go in there and mow those down at least once every couple of weeks, I would think. Otherwise, they're going to grow taller than my vegetable plants and shade those out. Now, one thing some people have suggested doing is crimping them and kind of leaving that organic matter on top of the soil for weed suppression. I think that would work pretty well, but it still goes back to the idea of row spacings always constantly changing, and that's kind of an obstacle that presents itself when you talk about mulching or interceding cover crops between rows. So if we didn't do this little comparison as a result of weed pressure, and we're not planning on mulching our soil, we're not planning on interceding cover crops here, why did we do it? Well, I'll tell you why. So I wanted to test this idea that if we get the biology of our soils just really kicking and super active, that we won't have to supplement with any fertilizers. There's enough in that soil there to feed those plants, even for heavy feeding crops. And so this is definitely a long-term comparison. We're not going to get any, just astounding results, I don't believe, from the first time doing this. But over time, as we don't cultivate this and keep doing some no-till practices, I want to see if you really don't have to use any fertilizer if you don't till your soil and you have very biologically active soils. Now, like I said before, my plots where I'm tilling, I'm only doing that 2 to 3 times a year. So it's not like they're just devoid of any biology. They're pretty healthy soils too. But we want to see no tilling at all creates this natural fertility that we hear a lot of people talk about. And to expand on that a little bit further, it's probably going to take another video. So there will be a part 2 to this where we'll talk more about kind of that natural fertility idea that we're trying to, test out and compare here. We'll also be talking about, the early results we're seeing, why we think this plot or some of these vegetables in this plot are looking better than that other plot, right now. We'll be talking about, is it more work to do it this way versus the way we usually do it? What are the advantages and disadvantages there? And I'll also be talking about some concerns that I have going forward as far as this no-till plot and some restrictions that I may find in the future about this way of doing things. As always, I love to hear your feedback, so if you have any questions or comments, definitely put those below. If you enjoyed this video, give me a big thumbs up. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Ring that bell so you get notified every time we come out with a new video. And if you did enjoy this one, check out these other 2 videos right here. I think you'll really enjoy those as well. We'll see you next time.